On January 10, 2026, Nicolas Maduro was detained in what the White House is calling a law enforcement operation. The images are everywhere: military transport, Caribbean airspace, formal charges tied to drug trafficking and corruption. The headlines scream regime change. The talking heads debate democracy. And if that's what you're watching, you're missing the balance sheet. This isn't about one man. It's about who controls the fourth largest oil reserves on the planet, who gets paid when those barrels move, and whether your heating bill doubles before spring. The spectacle is political theater. The mechanism is energy infrastructure. And the mechanism is what moves your costs. I'm Professor David O'Brien. I've spent 20 years in international political economy and energy market risk, focused on sanctions and shipping mechanics, and today I'm going to show you what the headlines are missing. Because what happened this week in Caracas sets a precedent that changes how oil flows, how tankers get insured, and how refineries on the Gulf Coast source the heavy crude they need to keep diesel and heating oil affordable. The question isn't whether Maduro deserved this. The question is, what happens to the 500,000 barrels per day Venezuela was exporting under license, who replaces Russian-backed logistics networks overnight, and whether U.S. companies can ramp production fast enough to prevent a price shock that hits every American filling a tank or paying a utility bill. This is analysis, not personal financial advice. But if you're on a fixed income and you've felt prices creeping up again, you need to understand the machinery behind this move, because the next 60 days will tell us whether this gamble stabilizes supply or fractures it. Here's the hard rule of energy geopolitics. The country that controls both the oil flow and the payment system controls the price, not the country with the most oil in the ground. The country that can guarantee barrels move from wellhead to refinery, that contracts get honored, that insurance underwrites the voyage, that dollars settle the transaction. Venezuela has the reserves. But for 15 years, U.S. sanctions have meant Venezuela couldn't fully control the system. Maduro's government kept producing, but under restricted licenses through shadow tanker networks, with Russian and Chinese logistical support filling the gaps. Chevron operated under a special license, bringing some barrels to U.S. Gulf Coast refineries. It worked, barely, as a managed stalemate. Now that stalemate is over. On January 6th, the Trump administration signaled it would push American oil majors to invest heavily in Venezuela, treating the country as the next big frontier for Western energy dominance. On January 8th, U.S. naval and law enforcement assets moved into position. On January 10th, Maduro was detained. By January 11th, the White House was framing this as a law enforcement precedent, a head of state charged, removed, and held accountable under international drug trafficking and corruption statutes. The political framing is bold, but the economic framing is what matters. Because the moment Maduro was detained, every contract, every export license, every tanker route, every insurance policy tied to Venezuelan oil became uncertain. And uncertainty in energy markets doesn't wait for clarity. It prices in risk immediately. Here are the numbers that create inevitability. Venezuela holds roughly 300 billion barrels of proven reserves, the largest in the world. But production collapsed from 3.2 million barrels per day in 1998 to under 700,000 barrels per day by 2020 due to mismanagement, corruption, and sanctions. Under limited licensing since 2022, Chevron and a few other firms brought production back to roughly 850,000 barrels per day. Of that, about 500,000 barrels per day were moving to export markets, mostly the U.S. Gulf Coast, under carefully managed licenses. Now those licenses are in limbo. The infrastructure is in limbo, the contracts are in limbo, and every trader, insurer, shipper, and refinery procurement officer is asking the same question: who guarantees flow now and at what price? Let me show you how this works by breaking it into three levers. Think of them as the control points, where power actually moves and costs actually rise. Lever 1, oil flow control. This is about physical infrastructure: who operates the wells, who manages the pipelines, who loads the tankers, who signs the export contracts, and who collects payment. If you can choke any point in that chain, you control the price. Lever 2, the invisible war. This is shipping, insurance, and payment systems. If a tanker can't get insurance, it doesn't sail. If a cargo can't clear payment, it doesn't get loaded. If a route becomes high risk, the cost per barrel rises even if not a single ship is actually seized. This lever is invisible to most people, but it's where costs explode before supply even drops. Lever 3, the Russia escalation angle. Russian-flagged tankers and Russian logistical networks have been moving Venezuelan oil for years, working around U.S. sanctions. If this operation targets or disrupts those networks, you're not just dealing with Venezuela risk. You're dealing with Atlantic escalation risk between the U.S. and Russia, and that risk premium gets priced into every barrel that moves through the Caribbean. I'm going to walk you through each lever, show you the mechanism, and then bring it home to your gas bill and your heating costs. Because this isn't theory. It's mechanical cause and effect, and it's moving fast. Start with lever 1, oil flow control. The physical chain is simple. Oil comes out of the ground at wellheads scattered across Venezuela's Orinoco Belt and Lake Maracaibo Basin. It moves through pipelines to storage terminals. From storage, it's loaded onto tankers at ports like Jose and Puerto La Cruz. Those tankers sail to refineries, mostly on the U.S. Gulf Coast, where the heavy crude gets processed into diesel, heating oil, gasoline, and jet fuel. At each step, someone has to operate the equipment, sign the contracts, and get paid. For the last few years, that system ran under a strange compromise. The Venezuelan State Oil Company, PDVSA, technically controlled the wells and infrastructure. But U.S. sanctions meant PDVSA couldn't access American banks, couldn't get insurance from Western underwriters, and couldn't sell freely into global markets. So Chevron operated under a special U.S. Treasury license, producing oil from joint ventures, selling it to U.S. refineries, and keeping the revenue in escrow or reinvesting it in operations rather than paying the Venezuelan government directly. Russian and Chinese firms filled other gaps, running smaller export operations and providing tankers and logistics. It was inefficient, limited, and politically uncomfortable for everyone, but it kept some oil flowing without fully legitimizing Maduro's government, now that compromise is shattered. With Maduro detained, the U.S. is positioning itself to directly influence or control the Venezuelan oil sector. Trump's push for American oil majors to invest heavily signals an intention to treat Venezuela like a post-conflict energy play, bring in Western capital, restart production at scale, and integrate Venezuelan oil into U.S.-controlled supply chains. That sounds good in theory. In practice, it means renegotiating every contract, replacing every operational relationship that depended on Maduro-era networks, and convincing investors that the legal and political environment is stable enough to risk billions of dollars. Here's what most coverage is missing. Even if the U.S. succeeds in stabilizing a new government and opening Venezuela to investment, it takes time to ramp production. Chevron's current operations produce around 200,000 barrels per day. Optimistic estimates suggest they could double that to 400,000 barrels per day within 12 to 18 months if licenses are lifted and investment flows freely. But that's not fast enough to replace the 500,000 barrels per day that were moving under the old system if those barrels stop moving now due to contract uncertainty or shipping disruptions. The gap is immediate, the ramp up is slow, and in that gap, prices rise. And here's the number that's not a typo. U.S. Gulf Coast refineries are specifically designed to process heavy crude. They need Venezuelan and Canadian heavy oil because light shale oil from Texas and North Dakota doesn't work in those refineries without expensive modifications. Right now, those refineries are running on a mix of Canadian imports, limited Venezuelan supply under license, and some Mexican heavy crude. If Venezuelan barrels drop even temporarily, refineries either cut production or bid up the price for Canadian and Mexican supply, and that cost passes straight through to diesel, heating oil, and gasoline prices. We're talking about a 20 to 30% utilization margin at some facilities. That's how tight the system is. So the first lever is simple. The U.S. wants control. But control takes time to operationalize. And time is the one thing markets don't give you when supply is uncertain. Now, lever 2, the invisible war. This is where most people lose the thread because shipping and insurance don't make headlines, but they move costs faster than anything else. Here's the mechanism. Every tanker that sails needs insurance. Not optional insurance, mandatory hull insurance, liability insurance, and cargo insurance. Without it, the tanker can't enter most ports, can't get financing for the voyage, and can't legally transfer the cargo. Insurance is underwritten by a small number of firms, mostly based in London and New York, and those firms follow strict sanctions compliance rules set by the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, and equivalent bodies in Europe. When Venezuela was under heavy sanctions, most Western insurers wouldn't touch Venezuelan oil shipments unless they were explicitly licensed by the U.S. government. That's why Russian and Chinese tankers filled the gap. They used non-Western insurance, often provided by state-backed insurers in Moscow or Beijing, and they accepted higher risk in exchange for higher fees. This created a shadow fleet, aging tankers, often with murky ownership, sailing under flags of convenience, moving Venezuelan oil to buyers willing to work outside the Western financial system. Now, if the U.S. wants to bring Venezuelan oil back into the Western system, those shadow tankers and shadow insurers have to be replaced or sidelined. That means Western insurers have to be willing to underwrite Venezuelan cargoes again. But insurers don't move fast. They wait for absolute legal clarity. They want to see stable government, clear licenses, no risk of asset seizures, and no risk of being sanctioned themselves for facilitating the wrong transaction. Until they have that clarity, they price in massive risk premiums or they simply refuse coverage. What does that look like in practice? Let's say a tanker owner wants to move Venezuelan crude to a U.S. refinery. Right now, with Maduro detained and the political situation in flux, the insurer looks at that shipment and sees uncertainty. Is the contract valid? Will the U.S. government honor the license? Could the cargo be seized in transit as part of some legal or enforcement action tied to the Maduro detention? If the insurer can't answer those questions confidently, they either refuse coverage or they charge a premium that can add $5 to $15 per barrel to the cost of moving the oil. That premium doesn't come from supply dropping. It comes from risk, and it gets priced in immediately there's more. On January 9th, reports emerged that a tanker carrying Venezuelan crude and operating under a Russian flag was intercepted by U.S. Coast Guard assets in the Caribbean. The details are still murky, but if that tanker was seized or even just delayed for inspection, the signal to the market is clear. The U.S. is tightening enforcement. Every other tanker operator, every other insurer, every other trader now has to assume higher risk of delays, inspections, or seizures. Even if 99 out of 100 tankers sail without incident, the 1% risk is enough to raise the cost for everyone. And here's the invisible compounding effect. If tankers are getting seized or delayed, fewer ship owners are willing to deploy their vessels on Venezuelan routes. If fewer vessels are available, shipping rates rise. If shipping rates rise, the delivered cost of oil rises. If delivered cost rises, refineries either pay more or they cut runs, and either way, the retail price of diesel, heating oil, and gasoline goes up. None of this requires a single barrel of production to actually stop. It's all risk premium and logistics friction. This is the invisible war. It's fought in insurance underwriting committees, in shipping charter negotiations, in OFAC compliance reviews. It doesn't make the news, but it moves the price at the pump. Now, lever 3, the Russia escalation angle. This is where energy mechanics collide with geopolitical deterrence, and the risk premium goes exponential. For years, Russian logistics networks have been essential to moving Venezuelan oil. Russian tankers, Russian insurance, Russian payment systems that bypass Western banks. This wasn't charity, it was strategic. Russia gained leverage in Latin America, access to oil flows it could redirect if needed, and a proving ground for sanctions evasion techniques that it would later use after the Ukraine invasion. Venezuela gained the ability to keep exporting despite U.S. sanctions. Now, if the U.S. operation against Maduro explicitly targets or disrupts Russian-linked tankers, cargoes, or logistics networks, you're not just dealing with a Venezuela problem. You're creating an Atlantic flashpoint. Russia has every incentive to respond, not necessarily with military force, but with economic and logistical retaliation. That could mean redirecting tankers away from U.S.-friendly routes, tightening its own energy exports to pressure European allies who support the U.S. move, or simply raising the cost and complexity of moving any oil through contested zones. The mechanism matters here. Deterrence in energy markets works through uncertainty. If traders believe there's even a 10% chance that tankers in the Caribbean could be caught up in U.S.-Russia friction, they price that risk into every barrel. If insurers believe there's a risk that a Russian-linked cargo could be sanctioned retroactively, they refuse coverage or charge prohibitively. If ship owners believe there's a risk their vessel could be detained as part of a broader enforcement campaign, they keep their ships in safer, more profitable routes. And here's the compounding problem. The Caribbean and the Atlantic approaches are not just Venezuelan export routes. They're global energy highways. Tankers moving oil from West Africa to the U.S., from the Gulf of Mexico to Europe, from Brazil to Asia, they all transit these waters. If the perceived risk in this region rises, the cost of moving oil everywhere in the Atlantic basin rises. That's not a Venezuela-specific problem. That's a systemic repricing of energy logistics risk. We saw a version of this in 2022 and 2023 when Russian oil exports were sanctioned after Ukraine. Insurance costs spiked, shipping routes shifted. Some Russian oil kept moving, but at higher cost and through more complex networks. The global price of oil didn't collapse because Russian production didn't stop. It just became more expensive and more uncertain to move. The same dynamic is now being set up in the Caribbean. The production might be there. The ability to move it efficiently and affordably is what's in question. So here's the question nobody is answering. Who can actually guarantee flow and enforce contracts in the next 90 days? Not PDVSA because the company's leadership is either detained or in hiding. Not Chevron because their operations depend on U.S. government licenses that are now in political and legal limbo. Not Russian networks because they're being actively targeted by U.S. enforcement. Not any new Venezuelan transitional authority because they don't exist yet in a form that can sign contracts or manage operations at scale. The answer right now is nobody. And when nobody can guarantee flow, the market doesn't wait for clarity, it prices in chaos. This uncertainty freezes investment. No oil major is going to deploy capital into Venezuelan oil fields until they have absolute confidence that their contracts will be honored, that their operations won't be seized by the next government, and that they won't be sanctioned for working with the wrong people. No tanker owner is going to charter vessels on Venezuelan routes until they know they won't be seized or indefinitely delayed. No insurer is going to underwrite cargoes until they have legal clarity from Treasury and OFAC, and no trader is going to take delivery of Venezuelan oil unless they're certain they can resell it without legal risk. Every day that uncertainty persists, the cost of moving Venezuelan oil rises, and the likelihood that those barrels actually reach market falls. That's not a political problem. That's a mechanical problem. And it translates directly into pressure on U.S. refinery supply, which translates directly into pressure on fuel prices. So let me lay out the three paths forward, because this doesn't resolve in one direction. It branches, and each branch has different consequences for your costs. Path 1, tightening enforcement. The U.S. doubles down on sanctions enforcement, treats the Maduro detention as the opening move in a broader campaign to shut down all non-Western logistics networks around Venezuelan oil. More tankers get seized, more cargoes get frozen. OFAC publishes expanded sanctions lists targeting Russian and Chinese entities involved in Venezuelan oil trade. This is the maximum pressure path. The trigger for this path is clear. More enforcement actions, more asset seizures, more legal filings targeting tankers or traders. Watch for official OFAC updates, Coast Guard activity reports, and any announcements of expanded sanctions designations in the next 2 to 3 weeks. The measurable signal is shipping disruption. If tanker traffic out of Venezuelan ports drops by 30% or more, if shipping insurance premiums for Caribbean routes double, if major charterers start refusing Venezuelan cargoes, then you know this path is in motion. The consequence for Americans is immediate upward pressure on fuel costs. Gulf Coast refineries lose access to 500,000 barrels per day of heavy crude. They bid up Canadian and Mexican supply. Processing costs rise. Diesel, heating oil, and gasoline prices all rise within 30 to 60 days. If you're heating your home in the Northeast or Midwest, you're paying 15 to 25% more by February or March. If you're driving, you're paying 10 to 20 cents more per gallon at the pump by late January or early February. And because diesel is the backbone of freight transport, food prices and goods prices tick up as transportation costs rise. Path 2. Negotiated easing. The U.S. installs or recognizes a transitional authority in Venezuela, negotiates new licensing arrangements with Chevron and other majors, and provides legal clarity that allows Western insurers and shippers to resume operations. This is the managed transition path. The trigger is political, a recognized transitional government, public statements from Treasury or the White House offering new licensing frameworks, and visible engagement from oil majors indicating they're preparing to ramp up operations. The measurable signal is licensing activity. Watch for new general licenses published by OFAC that explicitly authorize Venezuelan oil transactions, for Chevron or other firms announcing increased production targets, and for shipping insurance costs to stabilize or fall. If you see tanker traffic resume at previous levels or higher within 4 to 6 weeks, this path is happening. The consequence for Americans is stabilization, but with a lag. Even if licenses are granted tomorrow, it takes weeks for contracts to be renegotiated, for tankers to be chartered, for insurance to be arranged, and for cargoes to move. Prices might stabilize by late February or March, but they won't fall significantly unless production actually ramps above previous levels, and that takes months. So you might avoid a sharp spike, but you won't see relief at the pump or in heating bills until spring at the earliest. Path 3. Chaotic disruption. The U.S. operation destabilizes Venezuela without creating a functional replacement government. Infrastructure gets damaged or neglected. Workers walk off the job, contracts collapse, Russian and Chinese networks pull back, but Western firms don't fill the gap fast enough. Production drops sharply. Exports halt for weeks or months. This is the fragmentation path. The trigger is instability. Reports of unrest at oil facilities, labor strikes, sabotage, or simply operational breakdown due to lack of management. Watch for production figures from PDVSA or monitoring agencies that show sharp month-over-month drops, and for export data that shows Venezuelan cargoes falling below 400,000 barrels per day. The measurable signal is supply loss. If Venezuelan exports drop by 40% or more and stay there for more than a month, this path is locked in. The consequence for Americans is severe. Refineries on the Gulf Coast either cut diesel and heating oil production, or they pay dramatically more for alternative heavy crude feedstock. Prices spike. You're looking at diesel and heating oil up 30 to 50% within 60 to 90 days. Gasoline follows. Freight costs explode, groceries and consumer goods get more expensive, and inflation reaccelerates across the board. If you're on a fixed income, your purchasing power takes a serious hit. Social Security doesn't adjust mid-year, pensions don't adjust, and savings get stretched thinner. So why should a 60-plus American care about the mechanics of Venezuelan oil infrastructure and Caribbean shipping insurance? Because those mechanics determine whether your fixed income covers the same quality of life next month that it does today. Let's translate this directly. You're paying for gasoline. The national average right now is around $3.40 per gallon. If Venezuelan barrels drop out of the supply chain and Gulf Coast refineries have to bid up Canadian heavy crude or cut production, that price rises to $3.75 or $4 within weeks. If the situation drags on or worsens, you're at $4.25 or $4.50 by late winter. That's an extra $15 to $30 every time you fill your tank. Over a year, that's $600 to $1,000 more just for driving. You're paying for heating. If you heat with oil, which millions of households in the Northeast still do, you're buying heating oil that comes from the same refineries processing Venezuelan and Canadian heavy crude. Right now, heating oil is running around $3.80 per gallon. If supply tightens, that rises to $4.50 or $5. An average household using 800 gallons over a winter goes from paying $3,000 to paying $4,000. That's an extra $1,000 you didn't budget for. Coming out of retirement savings or forcing cuts somewhere else, you're paying for groceries and goods. Every item in a grocery store got there on a truck running diesel. Every pallet of goods shipped from a warehouse runs on diesel. If diesel prices spike, transportation costs spike, and those costs get passed to consumers. A 10% rise in diesel costs translates to a 2 to 4% rise in grocery prices within 60 to 90 days. If you're spending $500 a month on groceries, that's an extra $10 to $20 a month, $120 to $240 a year. And here's the compounding anxiety. If you're on Social Security or a fixed pension, you don't get a cost of living adjustment until next year, and it's based on lagged inflation data. If energy prices spike in early 2026, you're absorbing that cost all year before any adjustment. Your purchasing power erodes in real time. You start making harder choices, drive less, heat the house less, buy cheaper food, skip discretionary spending. That's not a political issue. That's a mechanical consequence of energy supply uncertainty translating through refining, logistics, and retail pricing into your daily budget. This is why the Venezuela story matters. Not because of one man, not because of democracy or authoritarianism in the abstract, but because the physical infrastructure that moves oil from Venezuelan wells to American refineries is now in question, and the cost of that uncertainty lands directly on American households. So what do you watch over the next 30 to 60 days? Let me give you the signals that will tell you which path is unfolding. First, watch licensing and sanctions signals. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control publishes updates on sanctions designations and general licenses. If you see new general licenses issued specifically for Venezuelan oil, that's a sign of Path 2, the managed transition. If you see expanded sanctions lists targeting more tankers, more traders, more logistics firms, that's a sign of Path 1, tightening enforcement. Check the Treasury website or follow reliable energy trade publications that report on OFAC actions. Second, watch shipping and insurance behavior. There are maritime tracking services and industry reports that monitor tanker movements and charter rates. If tanker traffic out of Venezuelan ports stays steady or increases, if insurance premiums stabilize, that's a positive signal. If traffic drops sharply, if premiums spike, if major charterers publicly refuse Venezuelan routes, that's a negative signal. You don't need to track every ship yourself, but if you follow energy market news, these data points will surface. Third, watch for tanker seizures or route changes. Any additional reports of tankers being seized, inspected, or redirected in the Caribbean are signals of escalating enforcement and rising risk premium. If you see repeated incidents, especially involving Russian-flagged vessels, that's Path 1 intensifying. If enforcement actions taper off and tankers resume normal routes, that's Path 2 stabilizing. Fourth, watch production and export indicators. Organizations like the International Energy Agency and private firms like Caterpillar and Vortexa track oil production and export flows. If Venezuelan exports stay above 700,000 barrels per day, the system is holding. If they drop below 500,000 barrels per day and stay there, you're looking at real supply loss and Path 3 chaos. Fifth, watch for any Russia-linked escalation. This could be diplomatic, economic, or logistical. If Russia publicly retaliates by restricting its own energy exports or by creating friction in other Atlantic shipping lanes, the risk premium goes regional and costs rise everywhere. If Russia stays quiet and its tankers simply reroute away from U.S. enforcement zones, the impact is more contained.